If there's a single study technique that trumps all others, what would it be? Think about your professors. They don't need to study flashcards or do past papers because they review everything daily through teaching. Because when you teach something, you get to learn it twice. I picked up teaching in med school, which makes sense. The word doctor literally translates to teacher in Latin. And at the end of the day, what doctors do is teach patients. But teaching has helped me with so much more than just school. It's made me a more interesting conversationalist. It's how we started our side hustle and then turned that into a business. Teaching can change your life, but we don't need half-listening students with their cameras turned off to learn from teaching. The only person who needs to pay attention is you. I mean, me, or yourself, the one doing the teaching. So I'm gonna share our 4S teaching framework, and then how you can use it in 2 different ways. The first S is crucial. When patients have questions about their medications or diseases, I can't explain things to them using uncommon sciencey words. Most of my patients didn't go through medical school, so I can't talk to them the same way I would talk to other doctors. So it seems like the toxic exposure is accumulating in your ocular tissue, causing retinal degeneration of selective rods and bipolar cells. Louis' a smart guy, but this won't make sense to him. Instead, I would say, look, I know you're a painter or plumber, but here's the deal. If you don't stop eating paint, you're gonna go blind. So the first S is to teach in simple language, in a way that most people will understand. As Albert Einstein once said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. I imagine myself speaking to a complete stranger who knows nothing about the subject. I'll avoid using jargon or key terms that might be confusing, but it also forces me to know the definitions myself. I also like to imagine myself speaking to a child. I'll use simple language and simplify my explanations. This forces me to understand the most complicated topics by their basic ideas. The second S I had to learn the hard way. When I moved across the country for medical school, I was a lost boy in a new city. I was completely reliant on my GPS for navigation. A couple months later, I accidentally dropped my phone into the river, and surprisingly, it broke. I know, I was shocked too. But what's interesting is what happened over the next few days, because even though I'd been driving the same streets for months, I couldn't recognize anything. I never actually tried to learn my way around because I was so reliant on my GPS. And I realized that this is exactly what we're doing when we study with our notes open. We become dependent on our notes when we over-rely on them to teach. Most tests aren't open notes, so why study in a way that will handicap you for the exam? So the second S is to teach on stage. Teach as if you're up on stage with a microphone, no open notes, and speaking straight from memory out to a sea of students waiting to be inspired. This also works better when we teach out loud because it forces us to articulate things in our own words. When we're learning something for the first time, it's okay to peek at our notes, but ideally, teaching out loud and from memory is like the most reliable and quickest way to figure out how well you actually know something. Teaching on stage is how we overcome the GPS dependency trap. The third S I picked up while studying for my medical boards. A classmate of mine recommended I listen to medical podcasts, and I thought, oh, I can learn while I'm just doing chores to maximize productivity? Sick, dude. So I was at the gym, had my AirPods in, warming up a 315 bench, no big deal, whatever, listening to a podcast about gallbladder disease. And I was like, what the hell are they talking about? It was super confusing trying to understand the anatomy of the gallbladder and how that affected all the surrounding organs. So I put down the bench, I took out a piece of paper, and I made a crude sketch, and all of a sudden, everything I learned just clicked. So the third S is teach while sketching on pen and paper, iPad, chalkboard, whatever method helps you facilitate what you're teaching. Not only does it clear room in your mind, which can only hold about 7 things at once, but sketching activates multiple regions of the brain. We're absorbing, visualizing, creating, we're using multimodal learning. The fourth S is what makes teaching the ultimate learning skill. When we make our rounds at the hospital, attending doctors will cold call on us to randomly test our knowledge. I hated that feeling of being put on the spot and looking like a complete idiot in front of my classmates. If I didn't know the answer, it was embarrassing, but after that, I would never forget it. The information just stuck, and I realized they were helping us identify the gaps in our knowledge. So the fourth S is teach to stumble. We're deep diving into a topic and actively looking for our weaknesses. This is one of the best ways to review for an exam, because if we can't teach something, do we really understand it? So those are the 4 S's of teaching to keep in mind. Now let's look at 2 specific techniques. This first one was named after Richard Feynman, one of the most famous teachers of all time. He was a physicist who could break down quantum mechanics into simple ideas that anyone could understand. And he does this by asking why. Why is that? By asking why over and over, we're forced to break down a complex topic into its basic ideas. That's the power of the Feynman technique. Let's have a look. Step 1, pick a topic to teach. Step 2, remember the 4 S's. Step 3, keep asking why until you've broken down a topic to its simplest parts, as clear as possible, down to a science, or until you start to stumble and identify your weak points. And step 4 is to go back to your notes, videos, and professors and clarify those weak spots. Once you've filled in those gaps, teach it and condense it again until you're confident with the topic before moving on. All right, so let's do a little demo. I'm going to teach about cholecystitis. So cholecystitis is inflammation of the gallbladder. Let's sketch it here while we teach. The gallbladder is this organ next to our liver that stores a bunch of enzymes used to digest food. So with cholecystitis, this gallbladder is inflamed. Why? Well, this is often because a stone gets stuck at the opening here. If you think of the gallbladder like a tube of toothpaste, you squeeze the tube and toothpaste comes out this tiny hole. Well, imagine if there was a stone that was blocking this hole completely. No toothpaste is going to come out the other side, and all you're going to be doing is building up pressure from how hard you're squeezing, and that pressure is actually going to cause inflammation. So let's keep asking why, because it's very common for stones to form within the gallbladder. So why? So stones form because, I don't remember. So this is when I would go back to my notes and my resources to fill in that gap that I just identified.
5 minutes later.
Okay, got it. So the stuff that we're trying to squeeze out of the gallbladder, this toothpaste, is actually what we call bile. And bile is used to digest certain foods that we eat, mainly fatty foods. Why? So bile is actually composed of different chemicals, things like bile acids, bile salts, cholesterol. All these things work together that when they enter the intestines, they break down food. But sometimes bile doesn't function properly. Why? So if there's an imbalance in the components of bile, for example, if there's too much cholesterol in bile or something like that, this causes the bile to change consistency and clump together and form these little stones. Kind of like how toothpaste can harden when you forget to close the cap. Most of the time, these stones are harmless. Why? Well, because sometimes the stones are so deep inside the gallbladder that even though it squeezes, no stones get pushed out. But if the stone does somehow manage to get pushed out and it gets lodged in that small opening and blocks it, that's when we run into problems. So you can see that I've started with a complex topic like cholecystitis, and I've broken it down into very basic ideas, comparing it to toothpaste. Analogies and stories are a great way to associate and consolidate information together in a way that's easier to understand. So I'll keep repeating that cycle until I feel confident in my understanding of cholecystitis before I move on to another topic. The next technique was introduced in The Adult Learner, a book on adult education that's been used to teach technical skills, sports, and even corporate work life. The aim of this technique was to ensure that we understand how individual details fit into the bigger picture. And that's why it's appropriately called the whole part whole technique. The way it works is exactly how the name sounds. Step 1, you start by addressing the big picture, or the whole or main idea. Step 2, you then teach the details or the various parts of that whole. Step 3, then you wrap up by showing why the parts are relevant to the whole, why it's important to the big picture. We're constantly looping back to the big picture to provide context of every new idea that we introduce. So let's do another demo now. I'm going to teach cholecystitis and the gallbladder in general again, but this time, notice how the order of things I teach is different from using the Feynman technique. First, we start with the big picture, or the whole. So when we eat fatty foods, like cheeseburgers for example, our gallbladder helps us digest it. Remember the 4 S's, I'm sketching to aid in teaching. Now let's dive deeper into the details or the part. So when the food we eat enters our intestines, the gallbladder releases this fluid called bile that travels through a pipe called the common bile duct into the intestines. And there, bile works to break down fat so we can digest it because bile contains these fat-breaking enzymes. Bile is made up of different chemicals and enzymes, and if there's a chemical imbalance, it causes it to clump up and form little stones. So now relating it back to the whole, when our body needs to digest cheeseburgers, the gallbladder will squeeze and try to release bile. But what can happen, since there's stones, is that it can cause a blockage in that pipe and prevent bile from being released. Then everything gets backed up. The gallbladder will try its best to squeeze out bile, but all this tension and pressure causes inflammation, and that process is known as cholecystitis. So I just explained another part, what happens when bile backs up and pressure forms, leading to cholecystitis. Now let's tie it back once again to the whole. When cholecystitis happens, not only can it be extremely painful because our gallbladder is trying to squeeze on top of a stone and pressure is building up behind it, our ability to digest fatty foods like that cheeseburger is impaired. Plus, if we don't do something to remove that blockage, all the stuff that's backed up here can get infected since bacteria love stagnant fluid. So that's why it's important in the overall digestive health of the patient that we treat cholecystitis, either with medicine or surgery, so that the gallbladder can function properly to release bile and we can digest fat and we don't develop an infection, which can be fatal. We constantly make connections of why each part is relevant to the whole before adding on more parts. So did you notice the difference in order there? In the Feynman technique, I said, here's cholecystitis, here's the definition, and here's the explanation. In whole part whole, it's kind of reverse. I start with the situation, the big picture and explanation, and then I give the definition of cholecystitis. The reason this works so well is because it gives context and helps you understand how cholecystitis fits into the bigger picture of the human body and our digestive health. That way, if I were to throw in other complicated diseases like choledocholithiasis or cholangitis, you'd still have the context of the big picture to see how everything fits together. While the Feynman technique simplifies a topic, whole part whole connects a topic to the big picture. So once you've gotten more comfortable using each individual method, I'd highly recommend combining them together to make it even stronger. This is how it could look. Step 1, pick a topic to teach. Step 2, teach from memory and while sketching. Step 3, teach it starting from the big picture, the whole, and elaborate down to supporting topics, the parts. Step 4, keep breaking it down into fundamental ideas in the simplest terms. Step 5, then try to consolidate it all and connect it back to why it's important to the big picture, the whole. Step 6, teach to stumble and then fill in those gaps. And step 7, repeat the cycle. All right, are you ready to have your mind blown? This entire video was structured using whole part whole. I swear, go back and watch it again and you'll see that every time I introduce a new idea, I give the context first. Then I explain the detail or definition and relate it back to the whole. These teaching frameworks are a great start, and I seriously cannot stress how important teaching has been in my success as a student. But if you want to add more skills to your skill build, there are techniques that can help deepen your understanding of information even further. So check out this video right here. This is what helped me take my teaching abilities to the next level.